The slideshow that I have presented is absolutely perfect, and I hope you enjoy it. I was just mentioning my first short course was in 1967, and my boss then sent me over, and he said, okay, he said, they have this deal they call the short course over at Texas A&M, and he said, I want you to go over there and don't just sit around and drink whiskey. I want you to do something and bring the people in, and the commission's going to be there, and I want you to meet those commissioners and be active. So I said, okay. So I got here, and the Ramada was the only motel that we had at that time, and so I went over to the Ramada, and I got the ballroom, which could hold maybe 150, 200 people. And I said, well, I'd like to rent the ballroom, and we're going to have a cocktail party here tomorrow night. And they said, we don't have any arrangements, and we don't do cocktails, and you're out of luck. And I said, I'm going to tell you what. I graduated from Texas A&M in 1959, and I know where Whiskey Bridge is, and all you got to do is give me the room. And so we set it up, and at that time there were probably 200 participants in the conference, and they all came over and served their own whiskey, which I'd gone to Whiskey Bridge and got for them, and had a really, really good time, and there was no more complaining, and we didn't have some of the rules and regulations that the department has now. It didn't really matter whether you drank whiskey together or not, and things were a little bit different. As he did mention, I'm the former Executive Vice President of AGC. My replacement is Jennifer Woodard. Jennifer has been with us for 31 years. I hired her when she was in high school to work summers, and then worked summers when she went to A&M. Got a degree in political science. When she graduated, came back, wanted to go to work for us, and she's been there for 31 years and is extremely smart and extremely competent. Before we get started, there's a few things, housekeeping items that I'd like to cover with you. First, most presenters will tell you that the last 10 minutes of the presentation is for question and answers. Not true. We will have no questions and answers because I have no answers, and I'll give you all I've got during the first 30 minutes, and if you haven't got it by the end of that, you're out of luck. Second thing, does anybody in here have a cell phone? If you do, turn it on. Now, most people say turn it off. I say turn it on. And if you get a call, and if it's Sweetie Pie wanting to say, how are you doing, well, then keep that to yourself. But if it's the governor, then I want you to stand up, put your phone up where we can all hear, and we'd all like to hear that conversation between you and the governor. Even if it's Chancellor Sharp, we would be perfectly happy for you to stand up and say, yes, Chancellor, how are you? What can I do for you this morning? Speaking of John Sharp, before I get into the history, I probably ought to give you a John Sharp story. And I'm assuming that John is not within earshot, so I don't feel like I have to be at all subdued in my remarks about the Chancellor. This goes back when he was in the state Senate. And I received a call over at the AGC office, and he said, Tom, he said, this is Senator Sharp, and you're good friends with Chairman of the Highway Commission, Bob Lanier. And I said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, we are. We play tennis together. He wins and I lose, and we have a good time doing it. And he said, I want him to come over here and visit with me this afternoon. And I said, well, I don't keep his calendar. I know he'll be here. And he says, no, you get him over here this afternoon. I'll be on the Senate floor, and you bring him over here. So I called Bob and I said, Mr. Chairman, we've got a state senator that wants to visit with you this afternoon. Can we go over there and meet with him? And he said, absolutely. Let's go over there. Let's have lunch and we'll visit about what we're going to talk about with him, and we'll go over there at 2 o'clock. So I called Senator Sharp back and I said, Senator, we'll be over there at 2 o'clock. And he said, we'll be on the Senate floor, send a note in, and I'll come out and visit with you. Okay? So we go over at 2 o'clock, we send a note, Sharp comes out, and he said he had not met Mr. Lanier, and so they met and they visited, and so with that, Sharp says, well, Mr. Lanier, you're going to be calling on me about funding for highways, aren't you? And Bob says, well, as a matter of fact, yes, we're working with the House now, and I'll give a little bit more on that in a minute. We're working with the House now, but we're going to need your help. And Sharp says, well, he said, let me explain something to you. Tomorrow, the commission meets, and on your agenda is the loop around Victoria. If, in your wisdom, you see to pass or approve that loop around Victoria, you'll have me for life. I will vote for your tax. I will vote for the department. You will absolutely own me if you will just vote for that loop around Victoria. So Lanier says, well, you know, we'll think about that. And so he and I leave, and we're walking back over to the highway building, and he says, well, what do you think? And I said, well, do we need the loop? And he says, well, kinda. And I said, Sharp is a little bit of a scamp, but there's two of us that heard him commit, so what do you lose if you go ahead and approve the loop? So they did. The delegation came, the commission approved it, Lanier pushed it through, and so we're on fire. We now own one state senator. 2 weeks later, Sharp resigned to run for a higher office. The first 50 years of TxDOT, the department was charged. What do you want?
Get your images up for you.
Yeah, if we don't get it, we don't get it. Most of it's plagiarized anyway.
Your call. You want to just proceed?
The first 50 years of TxDOT, what was the department charged with? Your charge was to build a first-class road system that would connect county courthouses from each of the 254 counties in Texas. A first-class road at that time was defined as 40 feet of right-of-way, cleared timber, stumps 8 inches or greater had to be cut off at ground level, and larger stumps had to be rounded so that the vehicles could get over them. Each county was afforded the opportunity to name an unpaid road overseer, which incidentally was a much sought after position. Now, why would anybody want to be an unpaid road person in Texas? Well, they decided where and what was going to be spent in those districts. And so they could care less about the money. Now, and throughout my brief remarks with you today, I will fall off the traces and give you a little story, and this will be another one right now. We had a chairman of the commission that learned that lesson extremely well. His name was Ted Houghton from El Paso. Not that we built everything in El Paso that was possibly built, but where did Houghton learn his politics? From my next door neighbor growing up. 2 doors from me, there was a man named Fred Bunsen, and he had 5 children, one of which was Ted Houghton's mother. And Fred decided he was going to run for county commissioner. And the reason he was is both he and my parents had backed the loser from the previous county commission. And that meant our driveways continued to have mud. And we felt like if we got a new county commissioner, something wonderful would happen. So Mr. Bunsen would give us kids 7 cents for each of the opponent's posters he'd tear off of the telephone pole, and a nickel for each one of his we'd put up. So, and he got elected. And miraculously, our driveway was no longer mud, it had gravel. I learned then what politics really mean, and when you talk about a county commissioner mentality, I understand what that means as well. During those early years, each male, now Randy, you might think about trying to get a law that does this. Each male, the ages of 18 to 60, were required to donate 5 days a year to road building. No pay, but that was the way it was. You had 5 days, and you could pick when the department was busy and needed you, then you would pick and do your 5 days. In May of 1919, the department received their first districts, and there were 8 of them, and there they are. In 1917, and no, I wasn't there for that, James Paul Ferguson signed a bill to organize the highway department. Now, if you were looking up there, what you would see is a cookie jar, and that cookie jar would have 90% of it circled, and that was the part of the highway fund that Ma and Paul Ferguson wanted switched to their own benefit rather than building roads. As a result of Paul Ferguson's shenanigans, both stealing from the highway department and got into a big fight with the University of Texas, he didn't think that they were actually giving him what they should have, and so he vetoed their full appropriation. And the T-SIPs didn't take kindly of it, and so they led a program to oust Paul Ferguson, which they were successful in doing. Following that, in 1927, Ross Sterling was named chairman of the commission. He later became governor, as you know. He appointed R.A. Thompson to be the state highway engineer, and R.A. lasted 1 year, and out he went. The next highway engineer was Gib Gilchrist, and there's a picture of Gib Gilchrist. He was an outstanding person and was really the first head of the highway department to be honest and to work and to start organizing the department. In 1940, DeWitt Greer took over the department. Now, all of you have heard of DeWitt Greer. I don't know how many of you knew him. He lived just a few blocks from me, and interestingly enough, he lived right next door to one of the engineer directors, Luther DeBerry. They were neighbors. DeWitt was a great person. He graduated from Texas A&M. He served in the band played the trombone, as a matter of fact, and became engineer up the little town of Pittsburgh, and then was brought down with the highway department. And like I say, in 1940, he took charge of the department. He knew organization from A&M. So what's the parallel? And if there's an Aggie or two in the crowd that has been in the military, you will recognize that a district engineer is a company commander. A company commander wins the war. A district engineer is going to build the road system, and has been and always will be, except during a few brief years when somebody tried to take all their power away, but they're back now. They are the most important person with the department because they determine what roads are going to be built. They get them designed, they get them built, and they get them built on budget, and they do a great job. The division heads were like corps staff or regimental staff in the Army. And then, of course, the executive director, or whatever you want to call the chief executive for the department, he's the general that calls the shots. And that's what DeWitt Greer was. In those early days, he had such a strong voice and strangle on that department. If a state senator or a House member during those early years in the 40s wanted something, they didn't beckon him to come over. They called and pleaded for an appointment to come to the highway building and present their case in hopes that he would see fit to build it. Along this time, during his tenure, in 1949, Dolph Briscoe co-sponsored the Farm to Market program that got the farmer out of the mud. The real money came in 1950 when General Eisenhower did the Interstate Highway program. From 1940 to 1967 were the years that DeWitt Greer was in charge of the department. He had several important guidelines that he used, which we hope the department people will never forget, because they were important and they're what's kept this department viable. First, he had a choice between 2 or 3 big contracts to build the interstate program, or he could have a multiple of smaller contracts where these smaller contractors would be developed and would be able to be there to do maintenance and use local materials and have support from the local representatives and state senators. And that was his mission. We'll have enough big contracts, but we're not going to forget the rural part of this state, because we want those votes and we want those needs and that mobility. And that was a big deal for him. The next slide is a picture of DeWitt Greer. Before I tell a few stories about some of the contractors, and I do want to do that, but I think it's important for you to recognize the transition and what went on in building roads. The basic contractors that were out there learned how to manage employees, mostly men, either in the Army or working for 1 or 2 or 3 of the big construction firms. They knew how to manage men, they knew how to run equipment and keep equipment running. They didn't know anything about how to build a job or what it took in terms of resources and how to lay out a project and whatnot. But they didn't have to, because in those days, the department had, now they've got what, 10, 11,000 people? At those days, we had 25,000 employees. And we had an engineer mostly from A&M, on every project. And what did that engineer do? He would lay out the work, he would lay out the job. He was actually the person running the job, and the contractor was the person that was managing the equipment in order to build it. So what happened? Contractors, smart, they say, this guy went to A&M, I'm having my kid go to A&M and study engineering, and then he'll be as smart as Randy Hoffman. So that's what happened. So the transition that we saw in the industry was our joint meetings that were established in connection with DeWitt Greer initially were by and large contractors, rough, tumble, operate men, run equipment, and engineers that knew how to lay out projects and build things extremely well. Then we got the next generation, and here comes little Mr. Smarty Pants, who's got a degree from A&M, and so he's as smart as the highway department, okay? So what had to happen is our relationship with TxDOT changed, and there was more of a partnership instead of a rough and tumble guy versus a smart guy. And I'll give you one quick aside of how the rough and tumble guy works. Because fortunately or unfortunately, when I came with AGC, we had plenty of rough and tumble. One of my biggest fears, we had a contractor from Valley Mills, and he had a job in the Wichita Falls district. And he and the area engineer had gotten crossways. And so the area engineer says, well, you're an idiot, and you really don't know what you're doing, and you better change your ways if you ever expect to finish this job. Well, the old dirt guy, he listened, and he got in his car, and he drove down to the liquor store, and he bought him a fifth of Old Crow. And he started drinking that Old Crow up there and drank it all the way to Valley Mills. Well, when he got to Valley Mills, he drank the whole fifth. And so he was absolutely went from mad to furious. So it's like 9:30, my phone rings, and he says, Tom, he said, get up here. I want you to go with me, and we're going to go to the district office, and we're going to whip every engineer. And I said, well, okay. And I said, two of us, and how many in the district? He says, I probably don't need you. I can probably handle them all, but I need one backup man. So I'm thinking, oh my God. So I said, look, that'll be great. I said, why don't you go take a nap? Because it's going to be pretty strenuous to whip this many people. So you go take a nap and then call me when you wake up, and I'll come up to Valley Mills and get you, and we'll go to the district office and we'll work our way through the ranks. Well, God, I woke up the next morning at 4:30 and I'm in a sweat. What am I going to do? I'm headed up there. We're going to have a fight with all the highway department people. Well, fortunately, Old Crow died, and by morning, soberness fell in, and so we didn't have to go. Thank goodness. The outgoing of DeWitt Greer, the following head of the department was J.C. Dingwall. Dingwall, interestingly enough, little known fact, was probably the only executive director or head of the highway department that was not a registered engineer. And we had to pass a special bill. Now, he was a graduate engineer, but he had never gone and gotten his license. And as good as he was, he never was licensed, and so we had to get a special statute for him to be named engineer director for TxDOT. And I remember our first legislative session together, and in those days, the department didn't involve themselves in legislation. They wouldn't go over there unless it was demanded that they show up. They didn't. Now they've got, I don't know, 15, 20, 30, however many people over there at every hearing and whatnot. That was not the case back then. There was no TxDOT people at the legislature. So the unions decided, with DeWitt and Greer gone, there would be a weakness over at the department. So that would be the time to organize all the maintenance people. And if we get the maintenance people organized into the union, then we'll get the engineers, then we'll get the contractors. And they had visions of wonderfulness where the unions would take over the entire road building industry. So bill comes up to authorize, the first step was to authorize union dues checkoff. And so I went up and I talked to Ding and I said, God, we cannot do this. And he says, my hands are tied. And so I said, well, let's see what we can do. So I go up to the Capitol and I visit with several members in the Senate where the hearing's going to be held. And so I get one to say, I'm going to write a letter and have Mr. Dingwall come over and tell what is the effect if we do union dues checkoff. So they brought him over, and Ding gave his testimony, and I'll never forget it. He says, you know, we're going to do whatever the legislature tells us. Now, keep in mind, if we're forced to start deducting for union dues, then we'll have to deduct for the milkman, we'll have to deduct for the furniture store man, and he goes on and on and on and on, and he gives them about a 15, 20-minute dissertation about how terrible this would be without, of course, saying we like it or we don't like it. And the author was Babe Schwartz from Galveston, who, interestingly enough, after he got out of the Senate, represented the Texas Aggregate Association after he gave us 25 years of misery in the Senate. But at any rate, he gets up and he said, Mr. Dingwall, I want to express my appreciation to you for your unbiased remarks, and thank God they weren't biased, because I can't imagine what you would have told us. Let's talk a little bit about some of these contractors and what they've done and how we've moved ahead. I've got about 1 minute left. Yeah. See, I told you there'd be no time for questions. We're going to talk just about 2 or 3 contractors, and I'll shut up. Okay, first we're going to talk about Doug Pitcock, and I don't want Randy, I don't want you and Lanham to forget to tell him that I mentioned he's missed, because when he's here, I can always say I'm not the oldest guy in the room, Pitcock's here. He's not here today, so there you go. But that was a typical type thing. Doug grew up in a very modest family. They lived next to River Oaks, not in River Oaks, in a very modest home. He had a paper route. His paper route was in River Oaks, so he found out what it was like on the other side of the tracks, so to speak. Came to A&M, got his degree, went into the Army, intelligence, came back, and then ultimately, we first started with Farnsworth Chambers and ended up with a partnership with Claude Williams. Now, he has always been very pro-industry, and one of the problems that we had during those early periods is if you didn't work for 4 years or whatever it was for TxDOT or with a consulting engineer firm, you wouldn't get registered, okay? And we didn't think too well of that. We thought that if a engineer from TxDOT went to work for a contractor and they had engineering business on projects and the contractor's son graduated from A&M with an engineering degree, by God, he ought to be able to work under an engineer and get registered. And of course, thanks to Mr. Pitcock getting on that board, such is the case. And one of the first young men that took advantage of that was Keith Keller. Alan Keller and the Alan Keller Company personified how the industry grew, particularly in the rural areas. And we give a lot of credit to the big contractors that could have crushed these smaller people that were starting. Alan Keller is a prime example. Alan was a motor grader operator. Then he went to Doc Killian and said, Doc, I want to do my own business. I want to go to Fredericksburg. Would you help me? And so Bobby Briggs and Doc Killian says, Alan, we'll bankroll you. You go up there and start your company and run it. Now, and today, you probably could go ask and they'd say, well, we're going to cut your throat if you try to do it. But in those days, the Zacharys, the Brown and Roots, all of those big companies said, we're going to help you all we can, and did. They loaned them money, they loaned them expertise, they did everything imaginable to help those companies grow. And then, as I mentioned, when their kids went to A&M or Texas or wherever and got their engineering degree, they came back, and thanks to Pitcock, they were able to get licensed, and they all now have their license and move forward. The only other story that I want to kind of mention deals with Raymond Stotzer, who was an absolutely great engineer and a wonderful, wonderful person. And this will be my last story, okay? But everybody came in here on the Raymond Stotzer theory. So I got to tell a Raymond Stotzer story. It starts with Bob Lanier was appointed to the commission, and he goes in and he wants to know who decides what projects are being let and where. And Mark Good is the state highway engineer, and Mark gives him a mumble jumble, and Lanier don't like it. And so finally, Mark's pushed into a corner, and he says, well, here's Henry Pearson, my deputy. Henry, I want you to go over with Mr. Lanier the selection process on projects, how we get to contract, who gets to go to contract, and how. So Henry said, yes, sir. Oh, Mr. Lanier, I'll get it all put together. Next month when you come to town to the letting, I'll have it. So Bob Lanier, 6'5", a little bit short on temperature, a little tough. So he comes over and he says, Henry, I'd like to see now the selection process for these projects. And Henry says, well, Mr. Lanier, I'd love to do that. I'd love to share with you, but he says, I am so big. He says, look at my desk. It's covered with papers. I have not had time to get into it. So Lanier goes to one edge of the desk with his arm, and he pushes all the papers off his desk into the trash can. He says, now, Henry, you don't have that problem anymore. Well, 2 days later, Henry took his retirement. He had had all of that Lanier he wanted. So he came over to me and he says, Tom, what is the selection process? Why will nobody tell me? I said, it's Bubba. Bubba? What do you mean it's Bubba? I said, Bubba Williamson. He says, you're not making any sense at all. And I said, well, the district engineers run their district. They get their design. They're ready to go to contract. And the aggressive district engineers, like Raymond Stotzer, come up here about every 6 or 7 weeks and take Bubba out for drinks and dinner. So then when they've got a project, either in the Valley or in San Antonio, they go to Bubba and they said, Bubba, would you like to put my project up next month? And Bubba would put it on, and that was a selection process, and it worked absolutely perfect. Well, Lanier didn't think that was great, but he really respected Raymond Stotzer. Well, we were getting ready to change engineer directors. Okay, I'm almost through. Don't panic about the deal yet. Okay, so they had just appointed Robert Bass to the commission. So we go over to the Capitol, and Robert's sworn in. Now, you know, the Basses are not what you call poor people, all right? Everybody's heard of the Basses. They're not in millionaires, but maybe billionaires. Okay, but they got plenty of money. So we're walking back from the Capitol, and Robert's on the commission, and he looks at Lanier, and he says, Bob, he said, we've got to get a new engineer director. This one's retiring. Now, I have connections all over the world, and I'll be able to advertise, and we will bring in the best and the finest and the brightest and the smartest to head up this department. And Lanier says, God, Robert, I can't thank you enough. What you have offered is wonderful. Now, keep in mind, the three of us are walking from the Capitol over to what's now known as the Greer Building. And so he says, there's one thing, though, Robert. When we get to the Greer Building, it wasn't the Greer Building then, when we get to the Greer Building, we're going to give the job to Raymond Stotzer, but I'd like for you to go ahead and get all this done between now and the time we get over there. I want to thank all of you. I've enjoyed working with you, for you, by your side for over 50 years. The department's the most wonderful agency in America. You've built a wonderful road system. Proud to have been part of you, and keep up the good work, and you'll keep our state ahead of everybody else. Thank you.